Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Historical Snapshots Conversations. Today, we have our first returning guest, Sally Bedell Smith. In our first conversation, Sally and I talked about George VI and Elizabeth. Today, we'll talk about their daughter, Queen Elizabeth II. A little about Sally before we start. She's a New York Times bestselling author of 8 biographies, including Diana in Search of Herself, Grace and Power, and Elizabeth the Queen. Elizabeth the Queen won the 2012 Goodreads Choice Award for Best Book in History and Biography. Sally has also worked as a cultural news reporter for Time and the New York Times, a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, and an on air contributor at CNN. Sally, welcome back. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Roman. Good to be back.
Awesome. So, to get started, for some background context, when does Elizabeth's life begin, and what is she like in her childhood years?
Well, she was born on April 21st, 1926, in her parents' home at Bruton Street in Mayfair in London. Her mother had a terrible experience with labor, and so she was actually born by cesarean section. She arrived at 2:40 in the morning, and one of the really interesting coincidences that you run across as a biographer every once in a while is that day her husband's father, King George V, and Queen Mary entertained a group of relatives at lunch. And one of them happened to be Princess Alice of Greece, who was the mother of Prince Philip, who would be, of course, young Princess Elizabeth's husband in a few decades. But I love finding things like that. She was she had a she was a lively child, probably livelier than people would recognize now. But she had a sort of seriousness about her, and was very dutiful. It was interesting to me to find out that her grandfather, King George V, recognized her intelligence and her other qualities at a very early age. At the same time, he realized that his oldest son, Edward, who was his heir, had a lot of flaws. And he really did worry about what kind of king that he would be and whether he would, in fact, be a success. So he he thought that it might be possible for his second son, Elizabeth's father, Prince Albert, would take the throne and that she might well be queen someday. And it was fascinating to me to find out that at a very early age, they exposed her to pretty grown up situations. Reading in Queen Mary's diary, I saw that when they called her Lilibet, we'll call her Lilibet to distinguish her from her mother. When she was 4, she went to a luncheon with a group of wives of Indian princes that Queen Mary had organized. When she was 8, King George V and Queen Mary took her to a, a big service at Westminster Abbey that had to do with helping the unemployed. One really striking thing was that when she was 12 years old, there was a luncheon that her mother and father gave at Windsor Castle for the foreign minister of Poland. And this was only a few months before World War II. And it was striking that this was a moment of international significance because Britain was negotiating a treaty with Poland right at that moment in the in the months before World War II. And the idea that their daughter, 12 years old, would be there showed the degree of confidence that they had in her, and also that they recognized her intelligence and that she would understand that this was a very important thing to witness. So they did things like that during her childhood because they knew they had to begin preparing her um, for the possibility that she could become queen.
How do these decisions, how does this influence or impact her in those years?
Well, I think the first moment for her really was when she was 10 years old in 1936, and her father became king when her uncle, Edward VIII, abdicated. And at that moment, she knew what her destiny would be. And I think in the years after that, her mother and father both intensified her education. I mean, everybody says, oh, well, she was educated at home. She couldn't have had a very good education. She did, in fact. She had a very good governess, and her grandmother, Queen Mary, was very involved. And the most important thing that happened was when she turned 13, and her mother hired a man by the name of Henry Martin, who was the provost of Eton College, which was just down the road from Windsor Castle. And for 6 years, he worked with her, taught her about the English Constitution. And there's a 3-volume work by a man named Anson. And you can see her annotations and her underlinings, and it was something that she took very seriously. And she learned a lot. And much later, when she took the throne at 25, government ministers, the prime minister, were all sort of amazed that she was as knowledgeable as she was.
Do we have a sense of how did she feel or how did she think about the fact that this was going to be her role, especially since when she was born for those first handful of years, it was not going to be her?
Yeah. Well, obviously, she was aware that this was going to happen to her. And she knew that there were certain things that she needed to learn about to prepare. And I don't think it was anything burdensome to her. She had, I mean, I'm making it all sound very serious, but she had a very lively childhood. Um, and one great advantage was that her mother came from a very large family. And so she had lots of cousins that she played with. And she would often spend time at her mother's ancestral home up in Scotland. So there was a carefree part of her life. At the same time, she was very well aware what her future held.
Those years were also quite turbulent times in the world. There was the Great Depression and the war. How did these events impact her, if they did, or influence the way she thought about things later on?
Well, I think you have to say that that World War II was really the crucible for her childhood and her adolescence. She spent, much of it in Windsor Castle, but she wasn't cut off. She was very well aware. They had bombing raids. They had a shelter where they had to go. There were bombs that fortunately never hit Windsor Castle, but they did hit the surrounding areas. And they became too accustomed, as her mother said, I think, to the whistle and scream of bombs. But at the same time, she was given tasks. She had to host lunches for officers who were much older than she was. And when one of them would die in the war, she would write letters to their mothers. Um, so there were a lot of things that she did in the line of duty, and also she observed her mother and father. She was naturally quite a reticent girl, and her mother actually used to do role playing where she would pretend to be a dignitary and have conversations with her so she would be more socially at ease. But she was given responsibilities at a pretty young age. I mean, when you look at the current royal family and you see little George, Prince George, and last week he was invited to Buckingham Palace to come and meet with World War II veterans. Those are the kinds of things that, Lilibet did routinely. She became a colonel of the Grenadier Guards when she was 16, and she did her first inspection then. And of course, the biggest thing, and really the most impressive thing in World War II was at age 14 in 1940, 1 month after Buckingham Palace had been bombed and unknown to mostly everybody, her parents had nearly been killed. And Princess Elizabeth made a radio broadcast to the children who had been evacuated to North America, and it was an important broadcast for Britain, for the people who lived in North America and Canada, and she carried it off with great poise and great confidence. And her father, who, as had a terrible stutter and really struggled with his speeches, was so impressed that she did it sort of without a hitch. Um, so those were the kinds of things. She was given her first patronage when she was 12 years old. So these were all little building blocks that gave her the confidence and the experience that would prepare her to be a queen.
And so then the other big event of her life before becoming queen was she got married. Can you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about the marriage, their story, and also how does becoming married impact her or influence her?
Well, the astonishing thing is that she was all of 13 years old when she picked him out. The royal family made a visit to the Dartmouth Naval College in the summer of 1939. And Prince Philip of Greece, who was a relative of hers, they were both related to Queen Victoria. And he was at 18, he was a naval cadet, and she was 13, and he was sort of an Adonis. I mean, he was, sort of amazingly handsome. And she fell in love with him. Nothing much happened in the years immediately after that. But during the war, they began a correspondence, and he came to Windsor Castle when he was on leave. And eventually, they obviously developed a relationship. The Queen, in particular, was far more eager for her to marry, some English aristocrat with a big title and a huge estate, and to do that. But to Lilibet's credit, she knew what she wanted. And Philip was, he was a complicated character. He grew up in a very turbulent family. So he had a lot of, he had a lot of, he had a lot of confidence, and he had a lot of resilience. And he also was an independent thinker. And it's interesting to me that she would have chosen somebody who she recognized could help her one day when she became queen. And in fact, not only was, as she said years later, her strength and her stay, um, he he had a lot of innovative ideas of his own. He was a great modernizer. And so she was able to rely on him, not only for support, but for helping her to adapt to modern times, really.
So Elizabeth becomes queen at 25. Do we know how does she feel at that time? What is she thinking when she officially becomes the queen?
Well, um, I think, compared to her father, who was not really, he had not thought at all about the idea of becoming king because his older brother was already king and he abdicated. And I think it took him a while to build the confidence that he needed to reign. In the case of Elizabeth, although she was very young, she was only 25, she was very well prepared. Winston Churchill said, when he first heard, when he adored George VI, and he was really, really just so saddened when he died at age 56. He was young. Um, he said, "This new queen, she's a child." And I interviewed his daughter, Mary Soames, and she said that he told her that he realized very quickly that she was much, much more than a child. She was conscientious. She really knew her stuff. I mean, within days of becoming queen, she was meeting with ministers, foreign ministers. She was meeting with ambassadors. She was conducting herself with a great deal of poise. And everybody realized, as I mentioned earlier, how knowledgeable she was about the workings of the British government and how the constitutional framework was carried out. And Churchill, of course, developed enormous respect and admiration and affection for her, and that was quite mutual. But a few days after she took the throne, she wrote a letter to a friend, and she said, I can't really explain it, but all of my timidity has disappeared, and I really feel ready for this.
Interesting.
25.
Wow. And how does the public respond to her becoming the queen?
Oh, the public was ecstatic. I mean, obviously, they mourned the loss of George VI, but here she was, young and beautiful. There's a saying that, a monarch can be young and beautiful or old and venerable. And she somehow managed to be both in her 70-year reign. But everybody just adored her from the beginning. And the adulation both in England and when she went on her big Commonwealth tour in 1953 and 1954. She was away for 6 months. And one thing that's important to know about her is that the Commonwealth of Nations, which really took the place of the British Empire when all those nations became independent, was one of the most important things that she valued because she saw it as an alliance of nations of all sizes where everybody was equal and they were committed to values of civil society and education and preserving the environment as time went on. And she saw it as a unique forum in the world. She was head of the Commonwealth, so she had a sort of symbolic position. But that Commonwealth tour that she and Philip took really sort of cemented her role as a revered figure in all those Commonwealth nations all around the world.
How does she think about her role, and how similar or different is it to, let's say, her father?
Well, I think in many ways it was quite similar in terms of their sense of service, their deep sense of duty. One of the things she said about her father that she most admired was that he was steadfast, and she was steadfast. And she understood, partly from having observed him, partly from having studied what the English Constitution and the relationship between the monarch and the government was all about. She had a real sense that he had of where the boundary lines were. One of my favorite sayings about the monarch is that he or she is the light above politics. And she was very aware of those boundary lines. And in public, she always conducted herself with that recognition, as did her father. He was impeccable when it came to that. And, the other thing was, well, I mean, one thing about her father that I discovered when I was writing my book is that he was very down to earth and very approachable. And when he and the Queen went to Canada in 1939, the Governor General, Lord Tweedsmuir, who was the novelist John Buchan, said while watching the way they interacted with the people of Canada, he said he really is the people's king. I mean, it probably couldn't have been said about her because about Queen Elizabeth II because she was a little bit more reserved in the way she interacted with people.
And so through this time, what does support for her look like in terms of not a public sentiment support, but I imagine she's dealing with a lot of new issues. She's become the queen, lots of challenges. Where does she gather support in her life?
Well, I think her first support was her husband, and he was unequivocally behind her, and she consulted him in a lot of ways. She had very good advisors all the way through. I think one of her favorites was Martin Charteris, who she just had a lot of affection for him. He was famous for telling her, your role is to spread a carpet of happiness, which I always really loved. And she did that, and she understood what that meant. I mean, one of the extraordinary things about her, and I think you could say it about her son as well, is that she really, really knew every corner of the United Kingdom better than any of her prime ministers ever did. And I think you could say the same thing about Charles when, in the many, many years he had to wait to become king. And you could say that about all the nations around the world where the Queen visited and got to know what the issues were, what the people were concerned with. She was invaluable. And I think that's one reason why her prime ministers listened to her. I mean, she didn't advise them, but they relied on her to have her ear to the ground, as it were, particularly around Britain, to find out what people were saying and thinking.
So then how do these early years shape her reign?
Well, I think she was just learning how to go through how to go through all of her duties. And as I mentioned earlier, that Commonwealth tour was just an essential jumping off point, as it were, for her to develop an understanding not only of her own country but of issues all around the globe.
I'll ask this next question as a question with an assumption as part of it. But what do you think makes Queen Elizabeth the right monarch for the time?
Well, I think it had to do a lot with her character, her values, that she projected a sense of calm during turbulent times. I remember one of her advisors said that she was the sheet anchor that people would hang on to in times of trouble. She was a real unifying force. And she also recognized her role as a model of fairness and tolerance. And she took that very seriously. Um, and she was traditional. She respected all the traditions of the monarchy, but at the same time, she understood how to move forward, sort of without going too far ahead of the way things were changing, but to keep pace with it. I remember one of her private secretaries described to me something he'd said elsewhere, but it was important. He said he called it the Marmite theory of the monarchy. And, the Marmite jar has a very distinctive look. It's red and green and yellow. And everybody looks at it and thinks, oh, that Marmite jar looks just the way it has forever. Well, actually, if you go back and look at the Marmite jar 50 years ago, you'll see that it was different. And they've made incremental changes over the years that have resulted in the Marmite jar we have today. And the monarchy has been that way too. They can't get too far ahead, but they have changed the way the monarchy looks, the way it communicates, and I think she was very well aware of that, as is her son.
But she had a very long reign, and I imagine there were no shortage of challenges that came up during that
Yeah.
time. Is there one that stands out to you? And how did the Queen handle that challenge?
Well, I could probably name three. I mean, the one domestic challenge was, I'll divide them. The domestic challenge, I think, that really was tough for her was in 1966 with the Aberfan mining disaster when a huge mudslide engulfed a mining village and 100 and over 100 children were killed and something like 28 adults were killed. And Prince Philip went the next day. She, for all the right reasons, waited for a week. And she was criticized for being insensitive, but she wanted to wait till all the bodies were recovered, till it was safe for her to come and not impede um, their work. And she and the Crown really, I think, misrepresented how she reacted because she was very emotional. She talked to all these survivors and the relatives of those who died. And I think she handled it very well, but it was very difficult for her because she had been accustomed to not really showing her emotions in public. And she had tears in her eyes and she was very affected. I'd say that the global challenge that she handled very well was in the mid 80s when South Africa, everybody was concerned with South Africa's apartheid system, and the Commonwealth wanted to endorse very strict sanctions on South Africa. Margaret Thatcher, the prime minister, was very much against those sanctions because she thought they would harm South Africa economically. So there was a bit of a crisis. And the Queen, in her very subtle way, got the Commonwealth leaders together with Margaret Thatcher. And she sort of, without giving away how she felt about it, she sort of guided the conversation until they reached a compromise. And the ultimate result was the first step toward getting rid of apartheid, which was releasing Nelson Mandela from prison, where he had been for 27 years. And he later said he credited the Queen with having made it possible for the white government to, to do the right thing and end apartheid. The Queen had been sending messages behind the scenes to reassure Mandela and his colleagues that progress was being made. He and the Queen became very good friends. He was one of the two people who called her Elizabeth, which I thought was quite wonderful. And the third real challenge, I think, came when Diana died in August 1997. And the Queen was at Balmoral, and so were William and Harry. And her first instinct, which I believe to be the correct one, was to protect those boys and surround them with love. And until they had to face the funeral in a week in London. And so she kept them behind as long as she could. And a lot of people were very upset that she didn't come to London immediately because there were thousands and thousands of people who'd come to London to grieve and to go to the, witness the funeral. And she rightly did not go. And the one big mistake she made was to allow the flagpole above Buckingham Palace to be bare. And finally, she put a, Union flag at half staff. And on Thursday, before the Saturday funeral, they all came down. And she did some, I don't know how planned it was, but she got out of her car at the gates of Buckingham Palace and she looked at the flowers and really paid tribute to Diana. And then she did something the next day, which was highly unusual. She really didn't like to give a live speech. And she gave that live speech from Buckingham Palace, where you could see all the people wandering around the mall, and it was just pitch perfect. He recognized what Diana had contributed, and said that the royal family was going to learn lessons from the way she lived her life, and in doing that, in getting out of the car, giving that speech. She really turned public sentiment around because it was the first time that she really, I mean, not that people hated her, but that people were really, really angry at her. And that immediately switched. And she did one more thing on the day of the funeral when the cortege with Diana's coffin on the caisson came by Buckingham Palace, and the Queen and her family were standing out front, and she bowed to Diana's coffin. And again, that was another very important symbolic gesture. She had she had very good instincts, and she also listened. And those were three, I think, pretty good examples of how she dealt with those challenges.
Interesting. And how did she think about the end of her reign, the transition to Charles? How did she approach that?
I think the Queen approached her transition, and what she could see was, her life was, I mean, she lived a very long life. She lived to 96, but she recognized that she was losing strength. And as we now know, she had a form of cancer. Um, but she started pretty early. She was very mindful that she needed to hand things over to Charles. And I was there in 2013 in Sri Lanka when he represented her for the first time at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that they have every 2 years. And as I was watching him with Camilla carrying out all the things the Queen would ordinarily do, I I said to myself, "They're ready. They are ready. They look like a king and queen." I mean, quite a few more years had to pass before that happened. But she very, very gradually transferred a lot of things over to him in a way that was not all that apparent, and without her ever giving up her role or shirking her duty in any way. She fully prepared her funeral, as did Prince Philip.
Got it. So, what's the Queen's legacy?
Well, I think people were all are and I'll probably repeat some things I said earlier, but I think people will always revere her for the way she really set an example. She was a very steady presence. She was a symbol of unity. I remember somebody telling me about, I guess it was after the bombings in 2007 in London, and she was standing in front of Buckingham Palace all by herself, and they were having a commemoration, and the person who was watching it said, this is what she can command. She commands this enormous respect, and she represented continuity and tradition. At the same time, she knew how to adapt to modern life. And I think she was really a part of everybody's lives. She was this radiant presence that had, very few people didn't know what life was like without her as the Queen of Great Britain and her realms. Um, and there was a moment, I mean, I think she was always admired and respected, but there was a moment after the death of her mother in 2002 when she was coming out of a service at Westminster Abbey, and she was in her limousine being driven back to Buckingham Palace. And there was suddenly an eruption of spontaneous clapping and cheering, which was not what English people did typically when the Queen came by in her car. And it represented to some people that I talked to who were around her this sort of transfer of love to her. I mean, she was really, really loved. Um, and it was interesting to me to see that in her latter years, she was willing to show a sense of joy that was very evident to people who knew her in private. That was one of the surprises that I had when I was doing my research, was that she in private had a real, she was, I remember talking to the man who sort of ran the house at Sandringham, her estate in Norfolk, and he said, you could hear, I mean, this is a big house, 350 rooms. And he said, you could hear her laugh all over the house, and that it was a very joyful laugh. People had a chance to see that joyful part of her toward the end of her life. I think the best example of that was during the Platinum Jubilee when she did her surprise video with Paddington. And then earlier for the Olympics when she did her little skit with James Bond with Daniel Craig, and she didn't jump out of the helicopter, but it showed a sort of lightness of her that people hadn't fully appreciated until then. And I think the the recognition of her sense of duty was really sealed when people watched her literally the day before she died, when she was ill and in pain. And she got up in Balmoral and she greeted her new Prime Minister, Liz Truss, and said goodbye to her outgoing Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And I think people looked at that and thought, wow, this woman was serving her country to the very end.
She seems really remarkable. So when you look on Elizabeth's story, what is a lesson, or what are some lessons to take away from her life?
Well, I think one lesson is that having an effective monarch can be very important, and an effective monarch who is well trained. She once said, it all comes down to training, and I was trained very well. And those notions of discipline, dedication, conscientiousness, a sense of service she really, really believed in. And I think having her as a symbol, not only a symbol, but a working example of carrying out all of those traits was very important for people. And I was struck for Charles's coronation that his theme was service. And that's very much in the spirit and the tradition of his mother.
Sally, do you think is there anything that we didn't talk about that you feel like we should be talking about when it comes to Queen Elizabeth?
Well, yes, one thing, which is something she learned pretty early. And I think it came naturally to her because she was a naturally humble person. It was just inherent in her. But when she and Philip were in Australia early on, and the crowds were just massive. I mean, 1 million people in Sydney turned out to see them. And the Queen Mother, wrote a letter to Philip and said, because he'd written to her saying, how do we handle this? This is so overwhelming. And she wrote a letter to him saying, isn't it humble making that you can be the symbol of what the monarchy represents? In other words, it's not about you. It's about what you project about the importance of the monarchy and all of its traditions. And I think that was something that was very much part of the Queen, that humility, that modesty. And I think people recognized that and appreciated that. And it made a huge impact.
Sally, thank you so much for sharing the Queen story. It's been
Oh, you're
special.
welcome, Roman. I
Thank you.
always like to talk about her.